Jeanneau were kind enough to send us a new pair of rudders, rudder tubes, upper and lower bearings free of charge. Thank you, Jeanneau. They said it was a known problem and they simply replaced them. It looks like they've got a policy in place already. So if you have this problem, at least it's easy to resolve. I'd never seen what the installation looked like, so for me it was a bit of a learning experience. I thought we'd share how straightforward it was to change them. Let's start by looking at the components. First, we have the rudder assembly itself. Above that we have a large white composite or plastic washer cum spacer, which I think provides a low friction surface between the bearing face on the hull and the top of the rudder. Then above that and between the shaft and the rudder tube there is this copper lower bushing. I know on some other boat types it won't be copper. Then above that we have the rudder tube itself, which again appears to be a composite of some form. That's normally glassed into the boat so you wouldn't see it. The upper bearing assembly contains a rubber-faced stainless steel spring type seal at the lower edge, and then on the top it's got a strong flange to fix the whole assembly into the hard point in the hull. And then on the top face of these, above them, there's more of these big white flat spacers come washers. I think they're a match set, so we made sure they went back on the same rudder they came off. Above that is the quadrant, which has a big heavy through bolt. It's worth noting that the rudder hangs on this bolt, so make sure the rudder's supported before you remove it. Removal is a two-man job, one outside holding onto the bottom of the rudder to take its weight, and the other then goes in and removes that bolt and simply lifts the quadrant off of the shaft. The spacers can then be lifted off and placed just to the side and ready to go back on. And then the person outside simply twists and lowers the rudder, but be ready for a change in apparent weight after the first few inches of movement. This is because the shaft is chamfered at the top, and once that chamfer arrives at the upper bearing, which is the more substantial of the two bearings, then the friction that's taking some of the weight will be lost, and if the person outside isn't ready for it, it's a bit of a surprise. Just gently lower the whole rudder assembly with the lower spacer, possibly the lower bearing, clear of the tube, and lay it to one side. If it hasn't already come out with the rudder, remove the lower bush and that can be discarded. Then remove the 4 screws securing the upper bearing into the hard point in the hull, and you'll probably have to prise the upper bearing out of its hard point because it's normally sealed in with some CT1 or equivalent. Installation of the replacement rudder is pretty straightforward. That upper bearing unit is going to push down into a socket that's created by the hard point in the hull. First, place some CT1 or equivalent seal on the underside of the big flange at the top of the upper bearing, on the sides of the shaft of the upper bearing, and also on the bottom face where it mates against the rudder tube. Then simply align the holes in the hard point with the holes in the top flange and push the unit down into the socket. Next, thoroughly clean out the bottom end of the rudder tube and then reinsert the lower bearing. Put the big white spacer onto the rudder assembly and then carefully reintroduce the whole of the assembly into the bottom end of the rudder tube, making sure that that flange on the top of the rudder shaft is clean and undamaged. Once the top of the rudder shaft reaches the upper bearing, resistance will increase. Gently twist the rudder and increase upwards pressure until the rudder is fully home into the bottom of the tube. Next, drop the 2 white spacers back into position on the top of the shaft. The person working at ground level now increases the upwards force on the rudder to slightly compress the lower spacer, and the person on the top of the shaft pushes firmly down on the quadrant until the bolt will go through the hole in the shaft. It can help to get the person at ground level to orient the shaft by just twisting the rudder blade so that the hole is easier to access. The engineer managed to remove and replace all the bolts and screws through the emergency steering cover, but Wear gloves because the underside of that cover has got quite a sharp face, so you do need to protect your hands. The upper bearing is slightly bigger, so won't pass through that hole. It's only a couple of millimeters too big, but it won't. So you need to find an alternative way of getting it in there. On our boat, that meant just going through the locker by the transom on the starboard side and removing the gas locker on the port side. And that was simply a matter of undoing 8 screws, undoing a big nut that holds the gas pipe, prising the locker out from the CT1 that held it into its mating face, and then disconnecting the drain pipe to pull it out of the way. It took about 5 minutes. That done, we could then reach round with the bearing and put it into place without too much bother. Okay, here's a quick first look at how bad that corrosion was. Just split the rudder. I was quite surprised how beefy the stainless steel structure inside is. I expected to see similar to what I'd seen on some other boats on YouTube, and found a lot more stainless steel in there, a much bigger plate with some quite substantial welds. So that's pretty good engineering actually. As we can see, there is clean metal coming up there, so I don't know how far down that's going to go. I'm going to have to get a metal cutter at that, so I will be looking at that later. But you can also see that the water has there penetrated down inside the foam, and some corrosion had started in there as well, so definitely worthwhile that they've made that change to the design. This was a bit of a shock. I expected these to be tubes. It turned out they're solid stainless steel. So I was more concerned when I saw the rust than perhaps I needed to be. I don't think there was any chance of these failing. As you can see, they've lost about overall about 4 mil, maybe 5 mil of diameter, but the rest of the stainless was absolutely fine. Big heavy shafts, so not actually too concerned about that. I'm really glad that we've got it sorted before we head off across the North Sea, but overall I have to say I'm quite impressed with the strength of this rudder assembly. I hope you found that useful or enjoyable. Please hit like, subscribe and that bell icon, that really helps us. Look forward to seeing you again soon on the Boat Cheap.